The Last Watch. This story is based on true events. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell in thick, silent waves, swallowing the sound of distant gunfire. The men of the 101st Airborne Division were cut off, low on supplies, and freezing in their foxholes. Among them was Private Danny Carter, barely 18, thrust into war before he'd even had a chance to live. Danny sat shivering, his rifle cradled in his arms. His breath escaped in wispy clouds that dissipated into the darkness. The cold had long ago penetrated his layers of wool and cotton, settling deep in his bones like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. His fingers, red and numb, trembled as he pulled a small, creased photograph from his breast pocket. Jenny May, her smile warm even in black and white. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, remembering the scent of lavender in her hair the day he'd left. He hadn't received a letter from her in weeks. Had she given up on him? Was she waiting? Or had something worse happened back home that he didn't know about? The thought gnawed at him, more than the hunger that had turned his stomach into a hollow pit, more than the cold that threatened to claim his toes, despite the extra pairs of socks. "Carter!" a gruff voice called out. "You still with us, son?" Sergeant Harlan, the oldest of the group at 34, crouched beside him. His face was a weathered map of experiences Danny couldn't begin to comprehend. North Africa, Sicily, Normandy. 3 years of war had etched permanent lines around his eyes and mouth. Yet somehow, he still found the strength to lead. "Don't go dreamin', kid. We gotta make it through tonight first." Harlan's eyes darted to the tree line, ever vigilant. "The Krauts are getting bolder. They know we're stretched thin." Danny nodded, stuffing the picture away, feeling a pang of guilt for his momentary escape. The Germans had been moving in, probing their position for days. If they attacked in force, their small squad wouldn't last long. The only thing keeping them alive was the illusion of strength. Fires were lit in abandoned foxholes, helmets placed on sticks to give the impression of sentries. It was a desperate game of survival, and the enemy was closing in. "You think we'll make it?" Danny whispered, immediately regretting the question. It revealed the fear he'd been trying so hard to mask. Harlan didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a battered tin of cigarettes, offering one to Danny before taking one himself. The ritual of lighting them, cupping hands around the flame to hide the light from enemy snipers, felt sacred somehow. "I made a promise to my wife," Harlan finally said, exhaling smoke that mingled with his frozen breath. "I told her I'd come home, so that's what I'm gonna do." He fixed Danny with an intense stare. "What about you? What did you promise your girl?" Danny thought back to that summer day at the train station, Jenny May's tears soaking into his uniform as they embraced one last time. "That I'd write every day," he said softly, "and that I'd come back a man she could be proud of." "Well then," Harlan said, clapping him on the shoulder, "sounds like you got no choice but to stay alive." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the soft crunch of boots on snow. Private Wilson, their designated lookout, slid into the foxhole beside them. "Sarge," he whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Movement to the north, about 50 yards out." Harlan's expression hardened. He signaled for quiet, and the 3 men crouched lower, straining their ears against the muffled silence of the snow-covered forest. Then came the rustling, a shape stumbling through the snow. Danny tightened his grip on his rifle, the metal cold against his palm. Through the swirling flakes, a lone figure emerged, moving unsteadily. A German soldier, barely older than Danny, clutched his side, blood darkening the white frost beneath him. His uniform was torn, his face pale as the snow around them. Their eyes met across the clearing, blue eyes, Danny noticed absurdly, like the summer sky back home. The German raised shaking hands, palms outward, whispering, "Bit, please." Harlan hissed, "Take him out, Carter." Danny's finger tensed on the trigger, muscle memory from months of training. But something stopped him. The man wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't a threat, not in his current state. Danny saw the terror in those blue eyes, the same fear that had kept him awake for nights on end. "He's wounded, Sarge," Danny whispered back. "And if we let him go, he'll bring his friends," Wilson added grimly. "We can't afford prisoners." Danny froze, caught in the impossible calculus of war. If they let the German live, he could report their position, endangering not just their squad, but the entire defensive line. If they killed him in cold blood, what would that make them? His heart pounded against his ribs. He thought of Jenny May, of her gentle nature, how she'd cried when he'd accidentally hit a dog with his bicycle. Would she recognize him after this war? Or would she see only the soldier, the killer he was becoming? The German soldier swayed on his feet, one hand still raised in surrender, the other pressed against his bleeding side. "Hilfe," he pleaded softly. "Medicine." Danny saw something fall from the man's pocket, a small book, perhaps a diary or a prayer book. The sight of it, this personal object, solidified something in Danny's mind. He exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle slightly. "We take him prisoner," he said firmly. "We're Americans, not executioners." Harlan swore under his breath, but relented after a moment's consideration. "Your call, Carter. But he's your responsibility." The unspoken implication hung between them. If this decision led to their deaths, Danny would carry that burden. They emerged cautiously from their position, Wilson covering them as Danny and Harlan approached the wounded German. Up close, Danny could see the soldier was even younger than he'd first thought. Perhaps 16 or 17, one of the Hitler Youth rushed to the front as the Reich grew desperate. "Sprechen Sie English?" Danny asked, one of the few German phrases he'd picked up. The soldier nodded weakly. "A little." He responded in a heavy accent. "I am surrendering." They disarmed him, finding only a knife and an empty holster where a pistol should have been. As Danny bound the German's hands with a strip of cloth, he noticed a photograph tucked inside the man's jacket. A family portrait, mother and father standing proudly behind their son in his new uniform. "Name?" Harlan demanded. "Heinrich Müller," the German replied, wincing as Danny tightened the bindings. "Please, I do not want to die here." They dragged the wounded enemy into their shelter, applying a basic field dressing to his side. The injury wasn't life-threatening, a piece of shrapnel that had torn through muscle but missed vital organs. Heinrich murmured his thanks as Danny offered him water from his canteen. "Why did you not shoot?" Heinrich asked quietly, when Harlan had moved away to confer with Wilson. Danny considered the question, watching snowflakes accumulate on the rim of the foxhole above them. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'm just not cut out for killing." Heinrich's laugh was bitter. "None of us are, yet here we are." As night deepened, the temperature dropped further. The men huddled for warmth, enemies made temporary allies by the more immediate threat of the cold. Heinrich drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering in German. Danny caught fragments. "Mother, home, forgive me." "You think he has a girl waiting for him?" Danny asked Harlan during their watch shift. Harlan shrugged. "Probably. Most of us do." He studied Danny with knowing eyes. That's not why you spared him, though, is it? Danny shook his head. I keep thinking about after, when this is all over. Will I be able to look her in the eye if I... He trailed off. That's the thing about war, kid, Harlan said quietly. It doesn't end when the shooting stops. You carry it with you. He scratched at the stubble on his chin. My daddy fought in the Great War, came back different, quieter, would wake up screaming some nights. He paused, but he lived. He had a family, found happiness again. Is that possible? Danny asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Has to be, Harlan replied. Otherwise, what the hell are we fighting for? The night passed in tense vigilance. Occasionally they heard distant gunfire or the rumble of vehicles, but their position remained undiscovered. Heinrich's condition stabilized, though he remained weak from blood loss. In those quiet hours, Danny found himself talking to the German prisoner, exchanging broken fragments of their lives before the war. Heinrich had been a student, dreaming of becoming an engineer. He spoke of a girl named Elise who wrote him poems. Danny told him about Jenny May, about his family's farm in Pennsylvania, about his hope to study agriculture when he returned. If I return, Danny corrected himself. Heinrich shook his head. When? He insisted. You must believe it is when. Dawn broke with the distant rumble of engines, too heavy, too numerous to be German, American tanks. Reinforcements had broken through. They had made it through the night. As the squad emerged from their hideout, blinking in the pale winter sunlight, Danny looked at the sky, feeling the weight of war pressing down on him. He wasn't the same boy who had left home. He had survived, but at what cost? As medics arrived to take charge of Heinrich, the German caught Danny's sleeve. Danke, he said simply. I will not forget. Danny nodded, unable to find words. What did you say to someone who hours before had been your enemy and who tomorrow might be again? Carter, Harlan called. We're moving out. General McAuliffe's orders. As they prepared to join the main force, Danny pulled Jenny May's picture out one last time. Her smile seemed different now, a reminder of innocence he wasn't sure he still possessed. Yet in it he also saw hope, of healing, of returning, of becoming not the man he had been, but someone forged in the crucible of these dark days, who could still find light. He tucked the photograph away, close to his heart, and whispered a promise to himself. If he made it home, he'd never let her go. And he would tell her everything, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts. Because if she could still love him, knowing what he had done, and what he had chosen not to do, then perhaps he could learn to live with himself again. As they marched toward safety, the morning sun glinted off the snow, turning the battlefield into a sea of blinding white. Danny adjusted his helmet, shouldered his rifle, and took a step forward, then another, 1 foot in front of the other, toward home, toward Jenny May, toward whatever man he was becoming. Behind them, the Ardennes Forest stood silent, witness to one small act of humanity amid the vast machinery of war. A single moment of mercy that, for Danny Carter, would make all the difference in the world that awaited him.